The first time my basement flooded, I thought a pipe had burst. The second time, I knew somebody uphill was lying, and by the time the lawyers got involved, that little ribbon of rainwater had turned into the most expensive act of stubbornness I had ever seen. My name is Jack Whitaker, and for 37 years I lived in a plain old ranch house at the bottom of Millstone Road, just outside a small Pennsylvania town called Briar Glen. It was not the kind of house anybody slowed down to admire. No fancy gates, no dramatic driveway, no giant windows blowing like a furniture catalog at sunset, just beige siding, a tired porch, a two-car garage, and a basement that smelled faintly like cardboard boxes, old paint cans, and every Christmas decoration my late wife ever insisted we keep. But that basement had one thing going for it. It was dry, bone dry, through blizzards, spring storms, hurricane leftovers rolling up the coast, wet Septembers, muddy Marches, you name it. That basement never took on water, not once. And when something stays reliable for that long, you stop appreciating it, the same way you stop thinking about your knees until one of them decides to make a sound like a popcorn machine every time you stand up. For me, that basement was just part of the deal. Safe, quiet, boring, dependable. Then Graham and Elise Voss bought the old Mercer place up on the ridge. Everybody in Briar Glen heard about it before the moving trucks even arrived, because small towns have two forms of high-speed internet, gossip and retirees with binoculars. The house had sold for just under $2.8 million, which in our area might as well have been a moon landing. The place was already big, but Graham and Elise did not buy it to live in it as is. Oh no. They bought it like a man buys a perfectly good pickup truck and immediately decides it needs bigger tires, a louder exhaust, and lights bright enough to signal aircraft. Within a month, the property became a construction site. Dump trucks grinding up the hill before sunrise, excavators clawing into the slope, workers shouting over diesel engines, pallets of stones stacked like castle walls, and every week, the hill looked a little less like a hill and a little more like someone was trying to teach nature how to behave. Now, I am not against people improving their property. I am not one of those old guys who thinks every new fence is the beginning of civilization collapsing, though I will admit, I have written one strongly worded email about a neighbor's motion light that could have interrogated prisoners, but this was different. Ram and Elise were not planting flowers or adding a patio. They were cutting into the grade, flattening terraces, raising retaining walls, and reshaping the entire direction of the land. From my kitchen window, I could see the slope changing, slowly but surely, like somebody was taking a hand and turning the whole hillside away from their house and toward everything below it, toward me. I remember standing in my driveway one afternoon while my neighbor, Earl Benson, leaned on his mailbox and watched a bulldozer push dirt around like frosting on a cake. Earl was 79, a retired lineman, and the kind of man who could predict rain by the ache in his shoulder and the smell of the air. He squinted up at the ridge and said, "Jack, water is going to remember where it used to go, even if they do not." I laughed because Earl had a way of sounding biblical over the dumbest things, but the truth is, that sentence stayed with me. Water is simple, maybe too simple for rich people with design consultants to respect. It does not care about your vision board. It does not care about imported stone or a pool house or whether your architect used the word organic 16 times in one meeting. Water goes down. That is its whole personality. Before the Vosses came along, rainwater spread out across the upper field, slipped through shallow swales, soaked into the grass, and moved slowly enough that nobody below had to think about it. But once they finished their big renovation, the hill looked sharper, cleaner, more controlled. And that made me nervous, because controlled for them meant redirected for somebody else. The first storm came about 2 weeks after the landscapers packed up. It was not dramatic. No thunder cracking the sky, no trees bending sideways, no weather alert screaming on the TV. Just steady rain, the kind that taps on the windows and makes you fall asleep faster. I went to bed around 10:30, left my boots by the back door, and slept like a man who had no reason to suspect his house was about to change its mind about him. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a sound I could not place at first. It was soft but steady, not dripping exactly, not the furnace kicking on, not the old pipes ticking in the walls. It was movement, a thin, nervous, rushing sound. I sat up, listened, and for a few seconds my brain tried to offer me comforting explanations, because that is what brains do when they are afraid. Maybe the washing machine hose slipped, maybe the sump pump is cycling, Maybe it is just rain in the gutters. Then I opened the basement door, and the smell hit me first. That cold, wet concrete smell, earthy and wrong. And when I switched on the light, I just stood there in my socks looking down at water spread across the floor like someone had laid a mirror over the room. It was coming in along the wall facing the hill, not from one spot, not from a neat little leak you could point to and say, "There, that is the problem." It was seeping, pushing, arriving with confidence. My old cardboard boxes were dark at the bottom. A wooden trunk full of my wife's teaching materials had already started to swell. The little train set I used to put around the Christmas tree for my daughter when she was small was sitting in half an inch of dirty water, and I remember feeling ridiculous for getting emotional over plastic tracks and a tiny red engine. But grief has a funny way of hiding inside objects until water comes along and opens the door. I spent the next 3 hours with a shop vac. Towels, and language I will not repeat because my daughter watches these videos sometimes and still thinks I am a better man than I am. By morning, the furnace had shorted, the water heater was coughing like a smoker, and I had about 3 inches of water in a basement that had never had 3 drops. The cleanup company came, the repair estimate started, and the first number landed around $5,000, which is a painful number when you were retired and your idea of a wild purchase is name-brand cereal. But the money was not what bothered me most. It was the timing, 37 years dry, and then one storm after that hill got carved up like a Thanksgiving turkey. My basement floods. That is not a coincidence. That is a sentence with the ending removed. So, the next morning, still tired, still smelling like wet, dry wall, I walked up Millstone Road to the Voss house. Their new driveway curved through fresh landscaping, all black mulch and little ornamental grasses standing at attention, and the house itself sat there behind huge glass panels like it was judging the rest of us for owning curtains. Graham answered the door wearing one of those quarter-zip sweaters men wear when they want you to know they have a financial advisor. Elise stood behind him, barefoot, holding a coffee mug, looking past me like I was a delivery driver who had forgotten the package. I introduced myself, told them what happened, and asked if their contractors had changed the drainage plan during the grading. Graham tilted his head and gave me this tiny smile, not friendly, more like I had misunderstood something obvious. "Jack," he said, "it rained. That is usually what water does." I tried to stay calm. I told him my basement had never flooded before, not once, and that the water came in from the side facing their property. Elise sighed like I had interrupted brunch. "Well," she said, "you do live downhill." I looked at her for a second, because there are phrases that sound innocent until you hear the contempt wearing shoes inside them. I said, "Downhill is not the problem. Changing where the hill sends the water is the problem." Graham's face tightened. He told me they had spent good money doing everything professionally. And then he added, "Maybe your old house just finally showed its age. That won't land it." I felt it right in the chest, because old house, old man, old problem. That was the message. Neat and ugly. I asked if they had permits for the grading and whether anyone had done a runoff impact study. Graham looked at Elise. Elise looked into her coffee. And there it was. That silence people make when the truth steps into the room before they can stop it. Finally, Graham said, "I'm not discussing our property with you." Then he closed the door, not slammed, just closed, which somehow felt worse, like I was not worth the extra effort. I stood there on their perfect porch, rain still dripping from the copper gutters, and I remember thinking, all right then, we can do it the neighborly way, or we can do it the documented way. So I went home, made a cup of coffee so strong it probably qualified as a building material, and called the township office. I expected maybe a polite brush-off, maybe some advice about adding a drain on my side, maybe a brochure printed in 1998. Instead, the woman on the phone got very quiet when I explained the hill, the recent grading, and the first flood in nearly 4 decades. She asked me to send photos. Then she said an inspector would come out the following week. And that was the moment I did not fully understand yet. The moment this stopped being a wet basement and started becoming a paper trail. The inspector who showed up the next Tuesday morning was named Carla Mendez, and she did not look like somebody who enjoyed neighborhood drama, which immediately made me like her. She had gray hair pulled into a tight ponytail, mud on her boots, and a clipboard that looked like it had survived 3 administrations and at least 1 dog attack. She did not ask me for gossip, did not ask whether Graham was rude, did not care that Elise had looked at me like I was something stuck to the bottom of a shoe. She just wanted to know where the water entered, when the storm started, when the grading work ended, and what the hillside used to look like before the Vosses decided gravity needed a rebrand. I walked her around the side of my house, showed her the wet line along the foundation, the soaked insulation, the little muddy trails where water had pushed through like it had been looking for a weakness and found my retirement savings instead. Then we walked uphill together. Graham saw us from his driveway and came outside in sunglasses, even though it was cloudy, which told me everything I needed to know about where this conversation was headed. He called out, "Is there a problem here, Jay?" Like I had brought Carla over for tea and trespassing. Carla introduced herself, calm as a church bell, and asked if she could inspect the grading on his property. Graham crossed his arms and said, "Our contractor handled everything properly." Carla smiled politely and said, "Then this should be quick." That was the first time I almost laughed during the whole mess. Lise came out a minute later wrapped in a cream-colored cardigan that probably cost more than my first car, and she stood beside him whispering, not quietly enough, "I told you this man was going to make trouble." The funny thing about that word, trouble, is people use it when they do not want to say responsibility. Carla spent nearly 2 hours walking the slope, taking pictures, checking the new retaining walls, looking at the shallow trenches they had filled with decorative rock, which looked pretty enough until you realized they were basically little highways for water. She crouched near the edge of their lower terrace and said nothing for a long time, just stared down toward my house, then toward the street, then back at the slope. When she finally stood up, she looked at me and asked, "Mr. Sancher Whitaker, the first flooding was after this work was completed, correct?" I said yes. She nodded once, wrote it down, and Graham immediately jumped in with, "It was a heavy rain event." Carla did not even look up. According to township records, she said, it was moderate rainfall. Graham's mouth closed so fast I could almost hear the hinge. 3 days later, the report came by email and regular mail, because apparently the township wanted to make sure I could be stressed in multiple formats. I sat at my kitchen table, put on my reading glasses, and went through it slowly. There were photographs, slope notes, runoff observations, and one sentence that made my stomach drop and my shoulders relax at the same time. Recent grading and hardscape modifications of the Voss property appear to have materially altered natural stormwater flow and directed concentrated runoff toward the adjacent downhill residence. In plain English, they changed the hill and sent the water at me. The report also stated the work had likely been done without the required drainage review, and that the Vosses were in violation of township stormwater management rules. I read that word, violation, maybe 6 times, not because I enjoyed seeing it, exactly, but because after being treated like a cranky old man yelling at clouds, it felt strangely powerful to see the truth written in government font. The township issued an order requiring Graham and Elise to correct the drainage issue, and the first recommended fix was not outrageous, at least not compared with what came later. A civil engineer suggested a French drain along the lower edge of their property, tied into a controlled outlet near the road, with grading adjustments to slow the runoff. Estimated cost, $18,000. Now, I know $18,000 is real money. I am not pretending otherwise. But when you live in a glass mansion with a driveway heated by some kind of witchcraft, and you just spent more than that on outdoor lighting, so your Japanese maple can have a more dramatic evening presence, it is hard to look your downhill neighbor in the eye and say the fix is impossible. Still, that is exactly what Graham did. The township gave them 30 days to submit a corrective plan, and on day 29, Graham knocked on my door. I opened it, and there he was, holding the notice like it had personally insulted his family. He said, "I hope you are happy." I said, "Graham, my basement filled with water. Happy is not exactly the theme here." Elise was standing near the curb, refusing to come any closer, like my porch had a dress code. Graham told me they were not paying for a drain because my house was old, because rain was natural, because the township was overreaching, because contractors could not be expected to control every drop that fell from the sky. It was a whole buffet of excuses. I let him finish. Then I said, "You do not have to control every drop. You just cannot gather them all together and aim them at my furnace." He stared at me for a second and said, "You know, people like you are the reason nobody can build anything anymore." That one almost impressed me. There I was, standing in a house built before his hedge fund haircut, and somehow I was the enemy of progress. After he left, Earl wandered over from next door with 2 coffees, and the kind of timing that made me believe retired men might actually have radar. He handed me one and said, "Rich folks hate gravity because it is the one thing they cannot buy off." That time I did laugh, but only for a second, because by then I knew this was not ending with a handshake. The township could fine them, sure, but fines would not fix my basement, and Graham had made it very clear he was more interested in winning than solving anything. So I hired a lawyer. Her name was Rebecca Shaw, and she worked out of a narrow brick office downtown between a dentist and a tax preparer, which felt appropriate because all 3 places involved pain, paperwork, and pretending you understood what was happening. Rebecca listened while I told the story from the beginning. She did not interrupt, did not make a face, did not promise me some dramatic courtroom victory like on television. She just took notes, then leaned back and said, "Jack, if the report holds up, this is not about rain. This is about redirected runoff, and that is a very different thing." Those words became the backbone of the case, not rain, redirection. Over the next few weeks, my life turned into a folder. Photos, invoices, weather data, old property surveys, township maps, contractor permits, drainage diagrams, and emails written in that careful lawyer language where everyone sounds polite but secretly wants to hit someone with a stapler. Rebecca subpoenaed records from the landscaping company, and that is when the story got worse for the Vosses. Their own design plan showed that the grading had been shaped to move water away from the house and outdoor living areas, which, fine, nobody wants water under their patio. But there was no meaningful downstream runoff plan, no retention basin, no engineered dispersal, no approval from the township for the changes that mattered. Basically, they protected their expensive house by turning my ordinary one into the place the hill exhaled. Their defense was exactly what Rebecca predicted. They claimed my basement was old. They claimed the foundation had probably been failing for years. They claimed the storm was unusual, even though the weather record said otherwise. They even suggested I had neglected maintenance, which made me madder than I expected, because I might be many things: stubborn, cheap, emotionally attached to a 20-year-old lawnmower, but careless with that house was not one of them. Rebecca brought in an engineer named Sam Patel, a quiet man with steel-rimmed glasses and the emotional range of a tape measure, and he inspected my foundation, the entry points, the soil saturation, and the slope alignment. When he finished, he closed his notebook and said, "Your foundation is not perfect, because nothing from 1969 is perfect, including most of Congress, but it is not the cause of this flooding. The cause is concentrated surface runoff from above." I wanted to frame that sentence. When the first hearing came, I wore my only suit, the one from my daughter's wedding, and sat in the courtroom feeling like I had somehow wandered into somebody else's life. Graham looked polished and annoyed. Elise looked bored until the township report came up. Then she looked worried, which suited her better. Their lawyer kept saying, "Act of God," over and over, like if he said it enough the judge might forget human beings had rented excavators. Rebecca stood and walked through the evidence slowly, almost gently, which made it worse for them. She showed the old drainage pattern, the new grading, the first flood, the inspection report, the missing approvals, the engineering opinion. Graham testified that they had trusted professionals, that they never intended to harm anyone, and I believed that part. Honestly, I do not think they woke up one morning and said, "Let us drown Jack's basement." The problem was simpler and uglier. They did not think about me at all. To them, downhill was just empty space where consequences could go. Near the end, the judge looked at their lawyer and said, "Counsel, rainfall may be natural, but concentrating and redirecting runoff is not the same as letting nature take its course." I felt Rebecca shift slightly beside me, not celebrating, just recognizing the door had opened. The ruling came 2 weeks later. The Vosses were ordered to install a township-approved drainage system within 60 days and pay me $14,000 for damages, including repairs and some of my expert costs. I should have felt relieved, and I did, for about 20 minutes. Then Rebecca called and told me they had filed an appeal. Of course they had, because some people do not hear no as an answer. They hear it as an invitation to spend more money proving they should have been told yes. While the appeal crawled forward, the drainage work did not begin, and every cloudy sky started to feel personal. I checked the forecast like a gambler watching horse odds. I moved boxes onto shelves. I kept the shop vac plugged in. I told myself I was being paranoid, but fear is just memory trying to prepare you. Then in late October, a slow storm settled over Briar Glen for 2 days. Not violent, not cinematic, just wet and patient. I was at the grocery store buying paper towels, because apparently irony does have a shopping list, when Earl called me. He did not say hello. He said, "Jack, you better get home." I left my cart right there in the aisle, next to a pyramid of canned tomatoes, and drove back through rain that seemed almost smug. When I opened the basement door, I already knew. The water was there again, deeper this time, moving across the concrete with that same quiet confidence, 4 inches near the far wall, maybe more. The new water heater was raised, thank God, but boxes, tools, shelving, drywall, all of it was getting hit again. I stood on the bottom step and something inside me went very still. The first flood had made me panic. The second one made me certain. I took photos, videos, measurements, timestamps. I put a yardstick in the water like I was photographing evidence at a crime scene, because in a way I was. Then I called Rebecca from the stairs and said, "It happened again." She was quiet for a second, then said, "Document everything, Jack." And as I looked at that brown water spreading across my basement for the second time, I realized the appeal had not protected Graham and Elise from responsibility. It had only given the water one more chance to testify. The second flood changed the entire temperature of the case. Before that, Graham and Elise could still act like the first one was bad luck, unfortunate timing, maybe an old house having an old house moment. But after the basement filled again, while their appeal was still sitting on somebody's desk, the whole argument started to feel less like a legal defense and more like a man standing in the rain insisting he was dry. Rebecca added the new damage to the record. Another $7,000 in repairs, cleanup, replacement materials, and the kind of small losses insurance adjusters never really understand. Because how do you put a clean number on watching your wife's old recipe box float sideways through brown water like it is trying to leave you too? At the appeal hearing, Grant looked different. The first time, he had come in polished and irritated, like court was just an inconvenience between meetings. This time he looked tired, not humble exactly. Let us not get carried away, but tired in the way people get when reality keeps showing up with receipts. Elise sat beside him with her hands folded so tightly her knuckles looked white, and for once, she did not look bored. Their lawyer made the same argument again, because when you do not have a new story, you put a nicer jacket on the old one. Rainfall was natural. My house was old. The township was overstepping. The proposed work was too expensive. But Rebecca stood up and walked the judge through the timeline. The grading, the first flood, the township violation, the refusal to correct it, the appeal, and then the second flood. And by the time she finished, there was this quiet in the room that felt less like silence and more like everybody had finally stopped pretending. The appellate judge upheld the ruling completely. The bosses were still responsible. The drainage work still had to be done. The added damages were allowed to move forward, and the 60-day clock, which they had treated like a suggestion, was no longer something they could ignore. I wish I could tell you I felt triumphant, like music swelled and I walked out of there with my chin up, but mostly I felt exhausted. Winning in court is not like winning on television. Nobody hands you peace. They hand you paperwork, and then you go home and check your basement again. The real twist came when the engineers finally started the drainage work on the Voss property. The original plan had been an $18,000 French drain and some grading corrections, which sounded almost simple by then. But once they opened the ground along the lower terrace, they found the hill was holding more water than anyone expected. The soil underneath was saturated. The water table sat higher after storms, and the pretty little terraces the Vosses had built were basically collecting runoff and feeding it downhill in concentrated pulses. The engineer explained it to me in a sentence I will never forget. He said, "The problem is not just that water is moving, Mr. Whitaker. It is that they taught it to move faster." That was when the project ballooned. A simple French drain became a full engineered water management system. Deep perforated pipe, gravel beds, filter fabric, catch basins, inspection ports, sump chambers, pumps, backup power, and a forced connection to the storm line near the road. It stopped looking like landscaping and started looking like something you would build under a small airport. The township brought in another reviewer, and that reviewer decided the amount of runoff could not just be dumped into a roadside ditch, so the Vosses also had to pay for upgrades to the municipal storm connection. Another $26,000 right there. And if you've never seen a wealthy man react to the phrase municipal storm connection, let me tell you, it is a delicate mixture of confusion, offense, and discovering taxes in real time. Graham tried one last time to fight the scope of the repair. He filed an emergency motion claiming the system was excessive and financially unreasonable. The judge denied it so quickly I almost felt bad for the paper it was printed on. Her written order said the remedy had to be adequate to correct the condition created by the property modifications. In less fancy words, you broke the hill, now you fix the hill. Around that time, their attorney floated a settlement offer, $40,000 to me if I agreed to drop the remaining claims and take responsibility for maintaining any drainage that affected my property going forward. Rebecca slid the offer across her desk and watched my face while I read it. I think she already knew my answer. It was not an apology. It was not accountability. It was a receipt they wanted me to sign so they could walk away. I told her no. Not angrily, not dramatically, just no. Because at some point, a check stops being a solution and starts being a way for somebody else to buy your silence. Construction went on for weeks. The Voss Yard, which had once looked like a magazine spread for people who say things like outdoor living experience, turned into trenches, mud piles, orange fencing, exposed pipe, gravel trucks, and men in reflective vests yelling measurements over the sound of pumps. The beautiful lower lawn was gone. The stone path was cut open. The ornamental grasses were stacked in sad little bundles near the driveway like witnesses waiting outside a courtroom. Earl and I watched from my porch more than once, drinking coffee like two old men at the world's slowest parade. He said, "Well, Jack, turns out water makes subpoenas." I laughed harder than I should have, because after months of stress, sometimes one dumb sentence can let the air back into your lungs. When it was finally done, the drainage system alone cost just over $96,000. Add the municipal connection, the legal fees, my damages, their own repairs to the torn-up landscaping, expert costs, fines, and the second flood claim, and the total passed $200,000. $200,000 because they would not spend $18,000 when the township first told them to fix it. There is a lesson in there somewhere, probably several, but the simplest one is this. Pride is a terrible financial advisor. The day the system was tested, the engineers ran water through the upper catch basins while the pumps kicked on below, and I stood at the edge of my driveway watching water that used to head straight for my foundation get pulled into pipes and sent toward the street where it belonged. It was not beautiful, not in the usual sense, but I swear to you, after everything that had happened, the sound of that pump humming felt like a choir. A month later, we had another hard rain. I did what I had learned to do. Woke up twice in the night, listened, opened the basement door, and went down with a flashlight. Dry. Completely dry. The concrete was cold and grey and boring again, and I almost cried from how ordinary it looked. That is the funny thing about peace. You do not always recognize it when it is loud and grand. Sometimes peace is just a dry basement at 3 in the morning. I saw Graham and Elise one last time before they put the house up for sale. They were standing near what used to be their perfect lower terrace, looking at the inspection ports set into the ground like little grey reminders. Graham had his hands in his pockets. Elise was staring at the mud where her stone garden used to be. Neither of them waved. Neither did I. For a second, I thought about walking over and saying something sharp, something satisfying, something that would wrap the whole thing up like a movie line. But I did not, because by then, I understood there was no line that could make it simple. They had not set out to ruin my basement. I had not set out to ruin their yard. But between those two truths was a long chain of choices, and every time they had a chance to stop, they chose pride over responsibility. So yes, I won. My basement stayed dry. The hill was fixed. The court said I was right. But even now, when rain hits the roof, I still pause and listen, because some experiences teach your body before your mind gets a vote. And I still wonder where this story should have ended. Should I have taken the settlements and moved on? Should they have fixed it after the first report? Should neighbors be expected to absorb damage just to keep peace? Or is peace worthless if it depends on one person staying quiet while another person redirects the problem downhill? I know what the court decided, but I want to know what you think. If you were in my shoes, would you have fought all the way to the end? Or would you have stopped once the money got that big and the whole neighborhood started watching? And if you were Graham and Elise, would you have admitted the mistake early? Or would your pride have dragged you into the same hole? Drop your honest take in the comments, Because this is one of those stories where everybody says they believe in doing the right thing, until doing the right thing comes with a bill.